Yeah, sure. Okay, I think we can start now. It's 7. So, dear ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you all to the online course on East Caucasian languages. It is organized by the Linguistic Convergence Laboratory of the HSC University, Moscow, Russia. My name is Anastasia Yakovleva. I am a research assistant in the lab and the moderator of today's session. Today is the 4th lecture in the series of 13, and it is entitled Nominal Spatial Morphology in East Caucasian Languages. It will be given by a leading research fellow, Professor Michael Daniel. Before introducing our speaker, I would like to clarify some organizational issues. So as usual, each lecture will be recorded, live streamed on YouTube and stored there afterwards. The lectures will go uninterrupted and then followed by a question period. Those of you who are joining the lecture via Zoom will be muted throughout the session in the interest of the lecturer and sound quality. You can send your questions via the Zoom chat or YouTube live chat. At the end of the talk, I will read selected questions out loud for the speaker to answer them. We apologize in advance that there might not be enough time to address all the questions, but Michael will be able to read them after the talk and hopefully find a way to answer you. So it's my pleasure to introduce Michael Daniel, leading research fellow of the Linguistic Convergence Lab and professor of the School of Linguistics in the HSC University in Moscow, Russia. He has diverse research interests, including linguistic typology, the grammar of Nakh-Daghestanian languages, social linguistics, and linguistic anthropology. He has performed extensive fieldwork on a number of Nakh-Daghestanian languages and co-edited a book on Mehweb, an East Caucasian language belonging to the Dargwa group. He is the author of multiple publications and book chapters in the fields of morphology, grammatical semantics, and multilingualism in such high-profile journals as International Journal of Bilingualism, Language Sciences, Linguistic, Language Variation and Change. He also co-edited several books. The most recent of them is the Mouton de Gruyter Handbook of Number. The book is now in preparation and is planned for 2021. I finish, and Michael, the Zoom is all yours.
Thank you, Nasta. Thank you so much. I'll try to share my screen right now. Now go to the, yeah. I hope you can see and hear me and see the screen, right? Let me just fix that one. Yeah, okay. So today I'm going to talk about, to make a kind of primary introduction to the spatial morphology of East Caucasian languages, nominal spatial morphology of East Caucasian languages. And before I start, I wanted to say that we decided to dedicate this lecture to the memory of Alexander Evgenievich Kibrik, our teacher, who first brought many of us to Dagestan, and who is also the major contributor to the understanding of the grammar of space. In Dagestan, on the left, the early, or maybe it's your right, I'm not sure. No, it should be your left, actually, if you can read me. That's a picture of him when he probably first started thinking about spatial paradigms in East Caucasian languages. On the right is the picture of him as many of us, most of us may remember him in not so long before he passed away. So this lecture is dedicated to him. I had a plan for this lecture. It consisted of 4 parts, but then I started rehearsing it and I realized that it does not fit into one lecture. So the 2 parts are taken out of this, but hopefully if the organizers, including myself, will decide to go on with this series after the new year in the second part of the course, maybe, then we can continue with these topics. I have to apologize to some of you because the audience of these lectures is very wide and have very different background. So at least this first lecture mostly includes the data. I have to give a very general background in the introduction part about the nominal spatial morphology of East Caucasian. But I hope that we'll get to the point where some of the things become less trivial and more interesting also to those of you who worked on spatial meanings in general. Okay, so this is part 1. Introduction covers basic design of the systems in East Caucasian and includes a discussion of how different from or similar to are the systems to the to the systems that we all know from European languages. There is this quote picked up by many people at different times in discussion of Daghestanian nominal inflection, which is also quoted by in Wiki on Tabasaran. Tabasaran was listed in the Guinness Book of World Records as having the largest case system in the world with 48 cases. Also, somehow, miraculously, Tabasarans themselves know this, and they believe that their language is champion in the number of cases in the Dagestan, which is not true, as we will see soon. And this is why Alexander Kibrik, in his paper from 2003, which is basically a recap and deepening of his pioneering work in 1970, describe the situation as nominal inflection galore. But there is a different view on this, essentially shared by Kibrik himself, or kind of introduced into theoretical linguistics by himself. But that's how Bernard Comrie's and Masha Polinsky's 1998 paper is entitled "The Great Daghestanian Case Hawks." Amazingly, it doesn't refer back to the 1970 paper by Kibrik, but the main idea is that they want to deconstruct this idea of the multiple case system of East Caucasian. That's why they use this term hawks. So let's have a look. On the next slide, I just put and randomized the order of the old word forms of the Archie word hetlena thing. These are only singular forms, and there are quite many. There are not as many as in Tabasaran. In Guinness version of Tabasaran, there are only 38. But I have to admit that I threw away some of the forms that Kibrik included because they are controversial, but added some others which were not included in his count. So yeah, there are many. Essentially, we can split this galore into 2 boxes. One of them would be syntactic cases, which is counting a total of 10. And the other box will contain spatial or locative forms, which are many. If you just look at the syntactic case, it's not so many. It's a rich system, but it's nothing so very much special. Many languages have more cases than this. So something happens in the spatial forms, but the problem is why should we put them into different boxes except for spatial meanings, except for semantics? And we will see soon, we'll see that semantics are not very good grounds to distinguish between these 2 boxes. So there must be something else except for semantics, just calling some cases syntactic and some other forms spatial. Otherwise, we could also divide the Latin paradigm into two parts and say, these are syntactic cases and these are locative forms. But we do not usually do that. Why is this so? And the answer is first put up theoretically by Kibrik, but before that, long used by traditional Daghestanian linguistics in terms of series. So what allows us to separate spatial forms from syntactic cases apart from semantics is what will be further called in this presentation by morphemes of the spatial template, or the fact that the spatial template, the spatial morphology of the noun includes two slots. How come? Let's have a look at the example on the left. You have a noun, stone, and the meaning from under the stone is expressed by a sequence of the stem, and then two suffixes. One of them glossed as sub, the other as L. Sub stands for, like Latin sub, under, and L stands for allative, motion from. And the important thing is that this form maps perfectly onto the spatial configuration, or rather situation, that is shown on the right side. So you have landmark, or in other approaches called ground, which is stone, and expressed in the word form. It's expressed by the stem itself. There's also spatial domain under, which is shown under the stone, obviously, which onto which the suffix, the first suffix, sub, maps. And then there is a third component of the spatial frame, which is motion event, moving from domain to outside the domain, which is shown here as from in English, and which corresponds to the gloss allative. So the internal structure of this word form, maps perfectly morphologically, and there is an isomorphism between this morphological structure and the structure of frame, except of course for the figure or trajectory in other approaches, which is B, which should be expressed somewhere in the clause. So the B flew from under the stone. The B would be an argument or something else in the clause, while the rest of the spatial framework is expressed in the spatial form. Okay, but we don't see yet a galore of forms. We only see one form, from under the stone. What contributes to the abundance of these forms is the fact that the stem may be followed not by just one or two suffixes, sub and something else, but a full range of suffixes corresponding to different spatial configurations. So instead of sub in the first position of the template, you can have the suffix which is glossed as in, or inside a hollow object, or inter, inside a substance like in the water. In would mean something like in a box. Inter would mean something like in the water. Super would mean on the horizontal surface of something, which would mean something like on the table. Cont is a little bit more complex, but usually it describes allocation on a surface with some kind of contact between the figure and the ground, like a picture hangs on the wall. And sub, which is location in this, which corresponds to the spatial domain under the landmark. So this slot is the first slot, and it can be occupied by 5 different meanings. And the second slot in Archie may be occupied by 6 different meanings. We only have seen in the example so far, we have only seen the allative meaning from under the stone, but other meanings that can be expressed in the same position are asif, or static location, in most languages expressed as quite expectedly expressed by a 0, by an absence of marker. Also, it can include the suffix lative, motion into the spatial domain, allative, as we have seen, allative, which would mean something like in the direction of the spatial domain without a focus on reaching or not reaching them, and other meanings which are translative, which is an important meaning, like a snake, crawled through, under the stone, translative corresponding to the path meaning of meaning of the path, and a very rare in Archie terminative meaning terminative suffix, which means that figure arrives at the border of the spatial meaning. But this is pretty rare in Archie. Okay, so what Archie does, and I wanted to add that that while the first slot pretty conventionally is called localizaция, or localization in some English texts, or series in traditional Daghestanian grammars, the second slot is less lucky. It had very different meanings, like motion case as opposed to syntactic case, or orientation, but orientation was then used for a very different, for localization. So there is a kind of confusion in terminology. And I want to kind of stay with these two terms that I'm using here: localization, which is, let's repeat, spatial domain defined relative to the landmark, and direction, the category of directionality, or motion or absence of motion of the figure relative to the spatial domain. Okay. So now we put the Archie forms in order. We have like 10. Is it 10? Yeah, it's 10. Fortunately, syntactic cases on the left, and then you have a matrix of spatial forms. I avoid calling them spatial cases or cases at all. It's better to think of them about these two parts of the nominal inflection in Archie or in other East Caucasian languages as two separate sub-paradigms. That's what I'm going to use. The sub-paradigm of cases or syntactic cases and spatial sub-paradigm. And you can see that essentially, with one exception shown here as a red dash, you yield all the forms simply by multiplication of the category of localization in the vertical line by the category of directionality in the horizontal line. It's not accidental that I used exactly this word thing as an example, because Kibrik insists that none of the words, none of the nouns in Archie has all these forms. And his paradigms in the grammar are kind of smaller, with some of the lines, or some of the lines absent for some nouns. But I picked up the word hetlena because it's used some kind of as a kind of hesitation, what you may call it in English, and so that kind of is acceptable with all these endings. It's maybe the only way to fill in the whole paradigm, except from grammatical exceptions as cont-essive. I'm coming back to this in a few seconds. Okay, so now you might have noticed that the English translation of the example is actually very similar to the structure of the Archie glosses, right? So what's different is the order in which they come. And of course, this is not something unexpected. So you just have here parsed the same forms in this table. You have the stem, and then the localization marker, and then the directional marker, the lative sh for Archie. But in Russian, as in English, the structure is the same. You have the element which corresponds to the direction in the first position, then followed by the element which corresponds to localization in the second position, and then comes the stem. But this distinction is obviously only apparently unexpected, because if we think back about what localization is and what is the relation of the directional meaning to the localization meaning, you will remember that localization is a spatial domain defined with respect to the landmark. So you can think of it as a function which takes the landmark as its argument. But what the category of directionality takes as its argument is already the spatial domain defined with respect to localization, to landmark, sorry. So it takes the localization from the landmark as an argument to itself. And then it's quite expectable that either you have to, depending on where you put the localization as a suffix or as the prefix, then you need to put in a compositional way, you need to put the directionality marker outside this, this pair. So either you have directionality localization landmark, or you have landmark localization directionality, but no other orders are expected, at least. What then makes East Caucasian different from the European examples? Are European languages so much different from East Caucasian? You also have this, in this example here, you see also the kind of templatic reflection of the East Caucasian template in the separation of the direction and localization meanings into two slots in both English and Russian. So what is different? First, it's morphological boundedness. And maybe this is something that I will have to pick up at another occasion. I had a section in the presentation that treated the issue of boundedness, but I have to drop it now. Let's accept that these are affixes rather than adpositions, rather than function words. So in English, it's expressed not by bound morphology, but by function words. And this is an obvious thing. And another thing which distinguishes English from, or European languages, or most languages actually, from East Caucasian languages is kind of regularity of mapping of meaning onto form. There is no accumulation. Same affixes are responsible for the same components of spatial meanings. If we think of spatial frames as consisting of localization markers, spatial domain, and directionality marker, then in East Caucasian, these two elements of the spatial meanings are clearly separated into two different morphological categories in Archie example. While in English, it's not the case. Look at these following tables, which compares spatial forms of Archie and spatial forms of English. On the left, you have kind of order. You have a bimorphemic structure, bimorphism in all columns except of the asif, which is 0 marked, which is unmarked. So it's simply a plain localization marker. And then if you want to add a directionality meaning, lative, allative, or allative, or allative, or translative and terminative, which I did not even include in the table because they are not kind of peripheral to me. You simply add the same element to the localization marker. So it's a clear agglutination. On the right, you have English forms. And here the situation is much more complex. If you want to express meaning of motion from a spatial domain, you may use from, just from, without indicating the localization meaning, both for from the wall, which would correspond to kont in Daghestanian languages, from the table, which would correspond to superlative in Daghestanian languages, from near, like from the tree, from being near the tree, which would correspond to apod-allative in Daghestanian languages. And also you can use from for the in localization, from the box. You can also say from inside the box, but the neutral and much more frequent way to say that from the box. So in a sense, for the allative, English collapses, conflates 3 meanings here out of 5 presented here. And the only 2 meanings that you probably cannot express, in my English at least, I know it's not native English, of course, but you have to specify the localization, is localization from between the trees and from under the stone. That's why I picked up exactly this example for the to show the structure of the Archie example above. Also, you have irregular patterns in the lative versus essive distinction. In a sense, if you think about these two meanings, localization and orientation, separately, then you could say that at is a cumulative realization or expression of apod and essive. And to is cumulative realization of apod and lative, and the same to is also optionally used as simply a lative marker for the localizations in and subsequent. So I don't think I have to really convince you that there is much less regularity in the English table than in the Archie table. The only thing that I wanted to stress is that in the English table, you also have some regular structures, like for inter and sub. You have between the same for essive and lative, that happens also in East Caucasian languages, but it kind of regularly distinguished from elative, from between. And the same relation between the spatial meanings is observed in the line for sub, on the one hand. On the other hand, when you look back at the Archie table, you also see that there is a point missing there. There is a slot, or not a slot, a case in this table, which is not filled by any form at all. So Archie, in this sense, is not absolutely regular either. Okay. But we still have this maybe illusion or belief that East Caucasian languages are more regular than many other languages, that the languages we're used to, at least, in terms of this kind of expression or co-expression, or not co-expression actually, of localization and orientation and directionality markers. See, I even sometimes I make this slip of tongue and say the old term orientation. I'll try not to do that so that as not to confuse you. I'm sorry, I'll close the window. Okay, but is it true that all East Caucasian languages are close to be perfect as Archie is? No, it's not the case. If we look at this table from Rutul, actually Kina Rutul, Kina dialect of Rutul, another Lesbic language, distantly related to Archie, the same branch, but really distant relation. You see that here, the spatial structure is kind of maybe closer, even closer to English in a sense. You may say that the elative, you might tentatively suggest that the suffix which is responsible for elative is la, because you see that in 3 lines out of 5. And it works for, at least for inter, for the last line, and for the second line, super. But it doesn't work for the second line from the bottom, for the sub. Because if you take away the la suffix, you're left with kh or k. That's a variation, and it's not the same form which is used for the essive, for the it does not correspond to the localization marker itself. And then if you look at apod and in at the first and the third lines, then you see that there is no la, there is vowel quality. So non-segmental type of means of expression of the same meaning. It may be that this vowel quantity goes back to the compensation of the loss of, or not compensation, to the drop of the intervocalic L. It's a possibility, but synchronically there is no such morphological process that drops L intervocalically in Rutul. So this is diachronically plausible suggestion, but not synchronical explanation. So in a sense, Rutul does not look anything near a perfect situation of Archie. So I wanted to give you this example to show that there is some variation between the regularity and transparency of the spatial paradigms across East Caucasian languages. But Rutul is a champion. To the best of my knowledge, it's the language which does its job. While it has some kind of spatial paradigm, it does not do that in a proper East Caucasian transparent cumulative way. Further, there are some languages which do not seem to have this special kind of morphological bimorphism of this spatial template at all in spatial nouns. Here belong all Nakh languages and Udi, an outlier Lesgic language. Of course, lots here depends on the description, and personally, I never worked neither on Nakh nor on Udi, so I hear without looking very much inside the systems, I here give you the interpretation by the authors. And even in this interpretation, there are some divergences. For instance, Yakovlev for Chechen, he suggests that there is some kind of derivation of spatial meanings from one of the locative cases, but he only quotes one locative case, lative, from which he says asif, allative, and allative and translative are derived. And it's not very clear whether all experts on Chechen would share the same vision of the Chechen nominal inflection. In any case, there is nothing similar even to the bidimensional, not very regular, but at least bimorphemic, let's say, two slots, bidimensional spatial paradigm of Rutul. Nothing is described distantly similar to this case. So there are some languages which are different in this respect from the kind of, let's say, the East Caucasian type, or Daghestanian type, maybe even better, because you will see just you soon will see on the map that Udi, Chechen, Ingush, and Sovatush are not spoken in Dagestan, but in other areas. On the other hand, there are also languages which further elaborate spatial morphology. So instead of making this less transparent, they add a third slot or third dimension to the same level of complexity. Here is a fragment of the inflection of the word mountain in Tanti Dargwa, and you see here that it goes far beyond the richness of the assumed richness of the Tabasaran inflection. Lander and Sumbatova quote here over 90 different nominal forms. So what happens here? As I said, a third slot is added to the nominal spatial morphology. So that might be called by analogy as Dargwa trimorphism. You have a stem, which is again followed as expected by the localization, as in the other languages we have seen before. Then next comes, and the localization, the inventory of localizations, we will not discuss this today, but it's different in different languages. In Archie, the number of localizations or spatial domains expressed by morphological means was smaller, was more reduced. In Dargwa, in Tanti Dargwa, it's larger, it's extended, while the inventory of directional forms of the category of directionality is reduced in Dargwa as compared to Archie, only 3 meanings here. But what happens next is that these forms may and sometimes must take the third position, which is meanings of going down or up, or hither and thither. So they include, in addition to the category of localization and directionality, they also include a special category which integrates deictic and gravitational meanings. And what is probably important here is that these this third slot, elements in the third slot, are probably cannot be argued to be anything like clitics, because the allative forms. So if you went from any of the localization to the elative and selected elative as your directional meaning, then you have to select one of the elements of the third slot. So it looks like real morphology, nothing like lytics. You need to take one of the elements of the third slot if you have chosen the elative in the second step. While if you have chosen the active or elative, you may or may not take the third step further. But that's not the only way in which the spatial nominal inflection may be complexified further as compared to the Archie relatively tame pattern. In some Cesic languages, there is another type of trimorphism, which is maybe a little bit more unexpected for East Caucasian. So here is the example of the paradigm of the nominal paradigm from Comrie 2007 on Dido or Cez, a Cesic language. So after the stem follows the localization slot, as expected, also quite rich range of localizations. And then comes a slot which is called deictic. And only after this deictic slot comes the directionality category. And this deictic slot may be either left unfilled, then it's unmarked form, which is interpreted as non-distal, or distal form, which means which locates the full spatial configuration, the frame, the landmark actually, at some distance from the speaker. So there would be a difference between saying under this stone here and under that stone over there, inside the morphology of the spatial morphology, between the localization and directionality. So something comes in between these two categories. Again, the relation between this category of the data category of distal non-distal forms and directionality category is not absolutely free, as we have seen in Darbois case. If you have an unmarked form, then you can select either elative, active, lative, allative, active, lative, elative, but not post. If, however, you have used the distal marker, then you have to select between active, lative, elative, and post, but not elative. So there is some kind of close cooperation between two slots, which does not allow, again, which shows you that there is some kind of morphological boundedness, at least between these two slots. Okay, so before we go to the second part, I wanted to show you this map. In the very bottom of the map, the two black dots are UD. This is the Lesgic outlier, which does not have a clear equivalent. It does have quite a few spatial cases, but it does not have a clear equivalent of the bimorphemic spatial template as the other East Caucasian languages. And the brown dots in the north, in the west northwest. I'm not sure how to say that in English. In the northwest are Chechen and Ingush, and Bats also in Georgia, which are also in a sense outliers. They are not. They are in contact with the Andic languages in the north of Dagestan, but they lie outside the main body of the stretch of the family. While Cesic languages in the which are I'm at loss how to describe the color here, something like very dark brown or very dark red maybe in the very west on the border with at the border with Georgia, and especially orange dots, the Dargwa languages in the very middle of the map are super rich. So there are guys who are super poor in the extreme south and extreme north west, and guys who are super rich who are not necessarily inside the main body, it says it like a bit outside, but in the stretch between this in the south to north dimension, they are really in the middle of the family, and they are richer than the other languages. Maybe there is something to this areality pattern. The only thing that we don't know exactly what happened in Nakh and Udi. We don't know whether they lost their template or they never developed it. There is no conclusive evidence for either of the options, I think. But there might be looming some kind of areality in terms of complexity of morphological systems here on the map. Okay, so takeaway from this introduction is, before we go to the second part where it would be important, East Caucasian nominal case forms are split into two sub-paradigms: syntactic cases, or simply cases maybe, and spatial inflection, spatial forms. And the galore that Kubrick describes results from the biomorphemes of the spatial forms, kind of combinability matrix morphology, where multiple spatial domains expressed by morphological means are multiplied by multiple values of the category of directionality, and form something which is may called as a rich agglutinative or spatial template. And a few languages go even further and sophisticate the spatial template, but some languages either never developed this kind of template or lost it in the course of history. Okay, so now I wanted to, so far, the moment that I divided all Archie forms into spatial and cases and syntactic cases, I never actually questioned what is the nature of this division, except I explained that this is a morphological division, but how does this morphological division maps onto semantics? Is it true that there is such clear divide between spatial semantics and syntactic forms in East Caucasian? Of course not. That never can happen, because we know that there is a general typological historical drift from spatial meanings into abstract syntactic meanings, more abstract than syntactic meanings. And we see traces of this connection, of these leaks, let's say, between spatial subparadigm and the syntactic cases everywhere in different ways. Let's start with the formal part. Some languages have markers, have case markers, syntactic cases, which with spatial semantics, or they have syntactic cases that are used but do not, the spatial forms that are used in spatial senses but do not form series. For instance, in quite a few Indic languages, there is the case called affective, which is used for some kind of experiencer. So if you're saying something like, I saw a woman or I found money, you would use your experiencer in your affective form. So it looks like it's a kind of non-canonical, what is called non-canonical subject. It's subject a purely syntactic role. But these forms in many Indic languages, again, to varying degree, have residual goal uses. So it seems like it's a kind of directional meaning which developed into a syntactic case. It does not have it is not part of the spatial subparadigm, because it does not it is not added to any kind of localization markers, but still it has some kind of spatial uses. Another case is Archie, the case in Khur, which is qualified as comparative in Kubrick's grammar, because its main use is indeed in constructions like I'm taller than you. You would be used, would carry a comparative case, but the same form still has some kind of residual uses very similar to apud localization, something like by, near, something like that. Very few, maybe idiomatized, but still are very present and easily found in the corpus, for instance. In Locke, at least in Zhirkov's description, there is a case which he calls ablative, which is not part of any spatial paradigm. So a spatial subparadigm has its own ablative or ablative source marker, but it's different from the ablative as one of the syntactic cases. So here you have a clearly spatial meaning, or at least what Zhirkov prefers it to see as a spatial meaning, as part of the syntactic paradigm, of the syntactic cases paradigm, and not of the spatial nominal inflection. In Lesgian, Agul, and Tabasaran, 3 Lesgic languages, you have extended uses of the dative form in the function of goal. Whether it's kind of language-induced, contact-induced change, or some kind of residual or language-internal development is unlikely. But whether it's kind of residual use or something which is contact-induced is unclear, but at least you have another case where a clearly syntactic case used for recipients is also used for as generalized goal, like to the city or something. And in various branches, that's the last case, maybe the most controversial. You use dative with contact verbs. So hit on the table or throw at him, something at him, would use the dative, which is meaning at least apparently related to spatiality. Okay, that's one case. So on the one hand, you have the cases where languages have an element of what we previously called syntactic cases, like comparative anarchy, which has some spatial uses. On the other hand, even more in a more consistent way, sometimes sometimes a marker which is used as a syntactic case is used as directionality marker in the morphological spatial template. For instance, in Khvarshi, the marker L in Zaira Khalilova's description is used on its own in the dative function, but is also added to the localization marker to form lative forms. So if it's added immediately to the nominal stem, it would use something, he gave something to me, or I saw something, because okay, he gave something to me, let's say. Let's stay on the same grounds. But if you add the same marker to the form with the localization suffix, then it would mean something like two under the stone, two behind the fence, etc. And Zaira even calls all uses of this affix. She calls all of them lative. So basically, for her, lative is also one of the elements of the syntactic case paradigm. In Mehueb Dargwa, there is the marker of the genitive, one of the markers of the elative are identical. In Zhirkov's description of Locke, he identifies the dative marker n with the lative suffix in the spatial subparadigm. In Avar, it's less clear. At least Alexeyev does not suggest that that's the same marker, but they are formally seem related. And of course, this relation is very natural and expected, because the recipient is an elaboration of a goal. So the obvious connection link between the functions of lative, motion towards, and recipiency is clear. And also in many languages, in very many languages actually, you see the connection between the source, the elative, and the genitive used in possessive constructions. Like in Russian, it's less clear, but it's also diachronically there. But in Romance languages, for instance, you have the possessive construction, possessive preposition, which develops from the former source mark, like in French. Okay. Also, there are less regular, less systematized, systematic relations that are shown here in this picture. On the left, you have archisyntactic cases. On the right, you have spatial forms. And for different elements of this paradigm, the temptation is sometimes stronger, sometimes weaker, to connect some of the elements of the spatial template on the right with the non-segmentable elements of non-segmentable markers on the left. Just as one example, there is a quotative case, which means roughly something like similar to the father, also used in constructions like speaking in avar. And here you have a similarity with the interlocalization followed by a suffix which is not otherwise used in Archie, etc. So these are connections which are less regular, but still suggest some kind of diachronic way of thinking about how this form might have evolved in the history. Okay, and this is of course very clear. As I said several times already, these are developmental links and connections which are pretty much expected of a language in general. Because in all languages, spatial forms have some extended uses. In all languages, including East Caucasian, the cause is very often expressed by some kind of source marking, from, out of, like out of joy in English. Temporal meanings are massively expressed by spatial forms. It's very rare that you find a special marker for temporality. Oblique arguments are often expressed by spatial forms in East Caucasian, like instruments or started of comparison, very often expressed by superlative from on him, I am higher, I am high, and also true arguments, as we have seen. Some experiencers are expressed by directional forms. Unintentional agents and model subjects, as in construction like X as capable of lifting up this stone, are very often expressed by some kind of source element of the spatial subparadigm in East Caucasian. So from on me, the stone, pick up the stone would mean I am capable, or very often I'm incapable of raising this stone. Also, accuracy of speech are connected to the direction. Certain types of recipients are connected to direction, and possessors are connected to are expressed by, some possessors are expressed by the static location form. So, and of course, this is all very natural. We know that from other languages. But let's try to look at them in a sense, if we consider them as conventionalized ways of expressing an experiencer, right? Then the template is kind of blurred. It's not anymore a bimorphemic structure. If an experiencer is expressed, for instance, by something like interlative, originally morphologically consisting of two morphemes, then when it starts functioning as experiencer, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't look like it makes sense to divide it into two morphemes, because this spatial meaning is not visible there. But this is something that I want to question in the small rest of my time. Should all such forms be viewed as morphologically complex or simplex, and how syntactic actually they are? I will focus on certain types of recipients and possessors, and maybe we'll come in the end to the accuracy of speech, but maybe not. We will see how lucky I am. To start with, some descriptions group these abstract meanings, possessive-related meanings, into some kind of small paradigms. So an author would say that apud essive expresses temporary possession, apud lative expresses temporary recipient, and apud allative expresses retrospective possessors, someone from whom something has been taken. And this seems to be systematic in at least some of these languages. You have the same localization marker, apparently responsible for this possessive kind of meaning, and then the directional marker, which is responsible to the either possession really, or future possession like recipiency, or retrospective possession like in the case of I took the book from him. So that already suggests that maybe they're not as syntactic as they still are part, at least they are analyzable according to these approaches at least. I'm not very not 100% convinced by these models, but we will see the semantic analysis of some of these meanings. Let's have a look. This is an example from Tukita, an Andic one village language in the north of Dagestan. And it says, your money is on me, or I have your money. Should we consider that as abstract possessive meaning? We have very similar constructions in English and French. I'm not a native speaker, but I think these are okay. Correct me if I'm wrong. I have your money on me, or I have no money on me, or je n'ai pas d'argent sur moi. I think these are acceptable in both languages. Would we consider these constructions as syntactic uses of spatial forms? It's not obvious, probably not. We still feel this as some kind of spatiality. So there's some kind of contiguity between the temporary possessor and the object possessed. There's spatial contiguity between these two items. So in a sense, what is supposedly possessor is a landmark, and what is supposedly a possessum is a figure, which is spatially related to the ground, to the landmark. Can we prove that? We can argue for that at least. Consider the following example from Agul, a Lesgic language. He had a gun that could fire 2 bullets. 2 bullets letting gun was on him. So basically, yes, literally it says he had a gun that could fire 2 bullets with him. Actually, we're agnostic. The speaker is agnostic as to whether the gun belongs to the guy or he only carries the gun. He is not talking about that. His focus is on spatial contiguity between the gun and the guy, because this is a scared man who is telling that he just saw a man with a gun that could fire 2 bullets and was very much afraid of him. So the important part was the gun. The gun was in the same place where the guy was, right? And he could fire these 2 bullets at him. It's not necessary that we insist that it's not his gun. Most probably, it belongs to the guy. Simply, it's not. So I argue that this is not a possessive, not really a temporary possessive predication, but a spatial perspective on the possessive relation. I have something on me, with me, and I'm not saying anything whether it's mine or someone else's. Let's pick up another example. I said previously that there are temporary recipients in East Caucasian. What the hell are there? What is temporary recipients? Let's have a look. All East Caucasian languages, according to my data, except Udi, distinguish between the so-called permanent and temporary recipients. And they use 2 different strategies depending on which recipient is there. Until very last time, there were not so many grammars that were mentioned, that mentioned at all this distinction between temporary recipients and permanent recipients. Now they are appearing, but that's kind of ubiquitous in across the family. There's only one language that is confirmed not to have this distinction. So the the difference, semantic difference between the two strategies is usually described as temporary versus permanent recipient, or slightly more precisely, change of ownership is involved, and then we use dative strategy, or change of ownership is not involved, and then we use later strategy. Here are a series of pictures drawn by Violeta Ivanova. Small stories telling about act of giving. So here are two women walking on a road, and one of them notes that the sun is high and it's time for prayer, and the other woman wants to pray, so she hands her son to this first woman. There is no change of ownership, obviously. She only hands the son for the time being while she prays. So the later strategy is used consistently. Dative strategy is impossible here. Then she prays, then she stands up, and then the first woman hands the baby back to the second woman, to his mother. Again, no change of ownership, because that the baby did not belong to the first woman. So again, later strategy. Okay. Another story about a beggar sitting by the side of the road, and the shepherd and asking for food or money, and the shepherd going by with his herd. Then the shepherd gives his bread off to the beggar. And that's change of ownership, because food is a typically type of theme of object being given, which is giving for good, for always, right? So it's a dative strategy here. And then it turns out that this is a king who was asking generosity from his subjects, and he liked the generosity of the shepherd, and he gave him the money, the pouch of gold to this shepherd, and there's change of ownership again. So this situation is described as a dative, by dative strategy. But then it turns out that it's a very modest shepherd, and he says, my bread only costs 1 coin, and he gives the pouch back to the king. So actually, we now know that no change of ownership happened in the previous stage. So this pouch does not and never belonged to the shepherd. And again, the latest strategy is used. Okay, so sorry. We had several examples where we see that change of ownership and no change of ownership selects different strategies, and that's a very obvious case, a very abstract notion, almost on the verge of being legal, and nothing spatial, right? So it should be the case that where we accept a full syntactic abstract development of a spatial form. In fact, it's not that easy, because if you look at the next example, there's a father distributing pieces of watermelon among his children, and all of a sudden the speaker used, describing this picture, used lative strategy instead of dative strategy, and that was quite unexpected for me. I didn't expect this to be used, because food is very typically type of object being given, which does not well combine with the lative strategy. And when I started to discuss this example with my Rutul consult, actually maybe she's even here, Sveta Mahmudova, she explained to me that in the exact sentence that the speaker used was that he gave these pieces of watermelon into the hands of his children, and the fact that he used into his hands, for her, it strongly suggested that the latest strategy had to be used. Why is it so? There is change of ownership. Why latest strategy? So the suggestion is that the speaker here may take a spatial perspective on the act of giving, and then he chooses the later strategy. And here, the spatial perspective is strongly suggested by the fact that he gives this thing into their hands. And I actually have another example from a different language, exactly like that, where it's mentioned that someone is giving money into the hands of the other person, and unexpectedly, also for money, the lative and not dative strategy is used. Then, to recap this distinction, while dative strategy does involve change of ownership, it's not fully correct to say about lative strategy that change of ownership is not involved. It's simply that the spatial perspective on the event is taken, exactly as was the case discussed above for the possessive, for the temporary possessor. It's not that we were conveying the information whether the possessor is temporary or permanent, but we were just saying that there is some contiguity between the human landmark and the object that he has with him, and that he can use this object. In the same way here, even though sometimes the object is given for good, not the dative but lative strategy may be used because a spatial perspective on the giving event may be taken. That does not work the other way around, because if the object is not giving for always, but also only landed, only given for temporarily to someone, then there is no change of ownership, and the speaker does not have any choice. He has to take spatial perspective on the giving event. So this is the only one available, the only one strategy which is available in such situations. And this is why in many descriptions nowadays, it's considered to be a distinction between change of ownership, no change of ownership, or permanent versus temporary recipient. It's not a very correct explanation of this. So again, we see not only temporary possessors, but also temporary recipients are not purely syntactic meanings, not purely abstract meanings, but have very strong ties with spatiality, if not spatial all way along. Most East Caucasian languages express addressee of speech by one of the lative forms. So only Udi, Lesgian, Agul, and Tabasaran use dative for the addressee of speech. There are some not very clear case for Avar, Botlich, and Lak, and some, again, not very clear case in Sahur, Buduch, and Kris, three East Caucasian languages, but all the rest of the family use a lative form, a directional form. Again, should we consider this use as purely syntactic? It's a kind of argument of the verb of speech, say. We are tempted to say this is a syntactic use, and it is listed as a syntactic use by many authors who work on spatial forms in East Caucasian. But if we think of a similar example in English, for instance, and Jesus said unto them, I am the bread of life, would we say that unto them is clearly a syntactic use? It conveys a very strong spatial metaphor, at least, or maybe even a spatial meaning. Again, my argument is that the use of the lative strategy to express, to code addressee of goal as direction, addressee of speech as direction is probably not evidence for syntaxicization of the spatial forms. Also, interestingly, dative is used in exactly those languages which have a relatively extensive use of the dative for goal. I have mentioned before that Lesgian, Agul, and Tabasaran use the dative as the as one of the very common expression of goal. I'm not so sure about Udi, but these three languages are otherwise the only languages of the family which use dative as which seem to use dative as really truly directional, spatial directional. And exactly in these languages you find the use of the dative for addressee. So maybe it's just the same story. The dative is used there as a spatial metaphor of the, as not syntactic but spatial meaning of the for the addressee. Okay, so the takeaway from this part is that, notwithstanding the peculiar formal design that we discussed in the first part of this lecture, in East Caucasian, as in other languages, there is no clear-cut separation between the spatial and syntactic subparadigms. And you see this all over the paradigms. You see elements of this, you see syntactic case markers used as part of the spatial forms. Some material is shared. Diachronically, some forms seem to have developed from spatial paradigm. Also, you see what you see in other languages: many bimorphemic forms convey non-spatial meanings, but importantly, some of the non-spatial meanings are more spatial than it may seem, as I have argued for the temporary possessors and temporary recipients, the obvious candidates for the non-spatial uses of spatial forms. They are much more, still keep the spatiality to them. So they are more special than may seem. I'm not trying to argue that all uses of spatial forms listed here. Let me go back just for a snippet of a second to this list. Yeah, here. That all of these meanings are spatial. For instance, I would not probably argue that experiencers are in any way keep their spatiality, semantically keep their spatiality in the function. Unintentional agents, but at least for some of these forms, I would argue that they are much more spatial than they might seem. And as a result, by considering this, by comparing the syntactic forms and syntactic cases and spatial forms in East Caucasian, where these two domains are clearly separated, we come to know much more about the evolution from spatiality into syntactic uses than we might know in the systems that we know of better, like in English. Of course, we know that in many languages, in very many languages, the marker for recipient develops from the marker for goal, but in languages like East Caucasian, we see how this happens, because we both have dative and we have lative strategy for recipients, and we see how the evolution may go from one part to the other. I think that I have to finish a little bit earlier than that, because I don't have time to start with the next part. Maybe I will have some more time for questions then. This is a view from one of my favorite places in Dagestan, from near to Kita village on the Ahvah rayon below it. Okay, thank you. Should I say something? I'm not sure what's happening right now.
Thank you very much for such an interesting lecture. We have a lot of questions. Thank you all the participants who participated in the discussion. Now I will, I think I will share my screen.
Okay. Yeah, just maybe I should have started with the disclaimer from the very beginning, saying that
we have a lot of questions. Thank you all the participants who participated in the discussion. Now,
that's a nice effect. Okay, yeah. I just wanted to say that I have not worked on all languages of the family, of course, and I will take the objections from the experts in this audience on specific languages. I just wanted to draw a very general picture, and maybe you will fit in with more details in your comments. Yeah, okay, I'm prepared to take questions, I think, right now.
Yes, here they are. Okay.
Okay, Johanna.
Can you first read this question aloud? I think it's...
Yeah, so are Caucasian localization systems mostly topological, or are they landmark-oriented or cardinal systems as well? In terms of nominal inflection that I were considering in this talk, the only additional elements appear in Dargwa, I think, because it includes gravitational meanings, which are closest to what you want to know, I think. But there are also some kind of other types of spatiality in the adverbial system. They do not use so much cardinal direction system of north, south, etc., but they use very much, and in every text, meanings like up river, down river. These are, or up mountain, down, up slope, down slope. These are meanings which are very important. I hope I answered your question. Okay, yeah. Is it also possible to derive new words by using these spatial forms? I'm not absolutely sure I understand the question, because what I was talking about was not, I was talking about the nominal morphology today, not in the perspective of derivation, but in the perspective of inflection. So you do not derive new words, you derive forms by using the spatial forms. I'm not sure how I can put the question of deriving new words into the context of this system. Then Wilson asks, can you comment on the role of unbound postposition in some of these languages and how they work in the overall spatial system? I hope I understand what you meaning here by unbound. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So by unbound postposition, you meant as opposed to the bound suffixes. The problem is that I had a special part of the presentation on it. I can try to, well, I can't share my screen right now. I can only briefly describe what the main points about it. It's different in different languages. In some languages, they kind of patch up the missing localization markers. So they are used for the meanings. For instance, in Mehueb, Dargwa, there is no sub-localization under this tone from which we started. Instead of using a suffix, Mehueb uses, I think, a combination of the dative with a postposition under. So this is one of the cases where a language employs a postposition in the fragments of the system where it does not have morphological element to cover this gap, let's say. But in other languages and very prominently in Endic languages, sometimes the localization meaning is reinforced by additional postposition. And in all these languages, postposition are ambiguous between postposition and adverbs, actually. So what a Tukita speaker could say, he could say, I have this slide, but maybe it takes too much time to switch between the screens. It can, a speaker can say cave in using the localization in, but the speaker can also say cave in inside, kind of reinforcing or doubling the meaning of the localization marker. So I see two general patterns, either very similar to what happens in European languages, like you simply use it at position to express a spatial meaning, or probably less similar, but I don't have this expertise. I'm pretty sure that other languages do this too, but I don't know of such languages, or examples do not come to my mind right now. They reinforce the meaning already expressed morphologically by some kind of additional function words. So these are two patterns. I hope I answered your question in this case. There are more to say, but maybe let's hope for another lecture at some point. Syntactic cases, Nastya, can you move it a little bit up? Syntactic cases further divide into lexical versus syntactic cases. Yes, yeah, I used, as I hope I showed in the second part of the talk, I divided the paradigm into syntactic and spatial forms somewhat arbitrarily by the properties of a morphological design. Of course, there are much more abstract cases like ergative and nominative and genitive, and some much more down to ground, concrete. Sorry, that's my timer. I don't know how to stop it. Okay. Yeah, so I was saying that, of course, you can't distinguish between different syntactic cases. And I even argue that some of these syntactic cases, formal syntactic cases, elements of the syntactic paradigm, are in fact pretty much spatial. So I fully agree. It was a matter of morphological design rather than semantics. Is allative derived from lative, maybe? Not in the languages I wait. There was another slide on this that I have to skip from the part of the presentation that I didn't have time to go over. And there are some languages where allative may be derived from lative. So there are internal connections between this. But was the question on Archie? Let me see. No, it was not an allative. It was a terminative, I think. The case Kena. And it's not clear. This form is not very clear to me. It's very rarely used, so I can't comment on it. The allative itself is not derived from lative. That's for sure. Do some languages have differential spatial marking? It is where nouns specify which localization suffix they are able to have exclusively. Yes, there is a discussion of this in Kibrick's book on Archie. He says that not all, first he says that not all nouns attach all localization markers, but of course there are some kind of specializations also, like especially abstract nouns like work, school, are neutrally combined with one localization, and some other words like village, for instance, neutrally combined with a different localization. But I don't think that I have this data. This is not in my presentation, so I can't discuss it offhand. Dmitry Zelensky asked, so you argue against an analysis where these peripheral possessive uses of locational cases are non-compositional. Wait, too many negations. Let me read it once again. do I argue against an analysis where yes, okay, that's complex. One thing I argue against is that they are, in fact, more spatial than they may seem. Whether they do form these paradigms that I have shown or not, that's controversial because some languages put the temporary possessor, the so-called temporary possessor, and temporary recipient and retrospective possessor into one series using the same localization, but some other languages use different localizations. So it remains to be seen whether these paradigms, sometimes even glossed, labeled as possessive localization in Hinaluk or in some Cesic languages, are not matter of accidental meeting of different meanings in the same localization. That remains to be seen. So I do not argue against non-compositionality and compositionality, but I certainly do not argue in favor of it. I just showed it for the matter of the further argument. There is a difference between onto and onto. Yes, but I'm not sure to what part of the discussion this relates. Yeah. I remember that was Jesus spoke unto them, right? I think. Yes, I'm not a native speaker, so I can't comment. But my understanding that maybe it's just kind of projected from my understanding of similar passages in the Russian Bible. But they also say, instead of saying the usual dative, some translations would use towards them, which to me keeps a very strong spatial element. Jesus spoke towards them. And I thought, maybe I was wrong, that a construction like Jesus spoke unto them has the same effect for English speakers. I should have probably asked that, informed myself with English speakers. Okay, so what I meant by derivation is to derive new nouns. Glasses, eye, relative. Okay. I think that I can think of very few cases I met, but it's not a regular kind of derivation in the languages I work on. I remember there was some kind of noun which was a combination of, I think, mud and one of the localization, and would mean a person who is not very neat. But I'm not even sure. It was years ago. It was data from Bagwalal. Otherwise, I do not think that this is a very productive, very common strategy followed by these languages. Is there a formal relation? Yeah, okay. So I think that it was the case labeled partitive by Kubrick is not really partitive in the sense that it's an archi. It's not really partitive in its function. It has a different function. So no, there is no formal relation between. As far as I remember, I have to let me check the slide, but I don't think it has any formal relation. Give me a second. Yeah, no, it's formally looks like a combination of an inter and lative. So it's unlikely to it's not an elative. So there is only a formal similarity, and I wouldn't even insist that sh in the syntactic case, kish is related to lative at all. But very frankly, I don't remember the functions of the partitive in archi because that's a very rare case. It's not commonly used. It's not the partitive as we know it from European languages. Let me see. Yeah. Do any of these nominal spatial forms have cognate forms and verb complexes? Okay, that does not happen in all languages. But in some less Greek languages, you have a clear relation between verbal prefixes and and nominal suffixes. So the commonplace in Daghestani linguistics is to suppose that both developed from some kind of postpositional elements in noun phrase and prepositional elements in verbal phrase. And if we are to trust the situation that we see now, where there is no clear difference between adverbials and postpositions, then it's very much like you had adverbial elements which developed into proverbs in the verbal phrase and suffixes in the nominal domain from postpositions. Okay, wait. Is it all?
Yes, our time is over, so we have to stop now. Thank you very much for the questions and for active participation. Thank you, Michael, for the lecture and for the answers. Yes, and we are waiting all of you in our following lectures. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank God for your patience. Настя, а вы можете сохранить мне вопрос? Секунду, не выключайте, я сейчас сам сохраню.
Okay.